man that is currently being held by the police after that murder in Essex, was apparently part of a programme called Prevent. Dr. Allen, very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's very clear, isn't it, that this is going to be an ongoing and quite difficult problem to solve, these so-called bedroom radicals.
Yes, I mean, obviously, as you say, the so-called bedroom radicals, they've had 2 years of living in their bedrooms with very little monitoring, very little understanding of what's been going on in the online space, but also, frankly, within communities as well. It remains a little unclear right now if we're dealing with this particular case. I don't want to speculate too much about the method of radicalization. And let's not forget that if we are dealing with this particular suspect, he had referrals many, many years ago to government programs. So clearly, this is not a new case of radicalization that occurred in the last 2 years. It is something that's been bubbling in his case for a long, long time.
Yes, and certainly most of the people, I said this the other day, who have been found to have been involved in these terrorist attacks, these so-called lone wolf attacks that we've been hearing so much about, have always been on the radar at some point or other, haven't they?
Yes, and this is, of course, one of the great issues, I think, that is, again, coming to stark relief from this case. We have people who are referred onto programs, and for whatever reason, they're either not taken forward, or de-radicalization or rerouting them is not working. So there has to be, I think, a comprehensive look at what is going on in terms of our prevention of extremism and terrorism programs. Why it might be the case that people are not being referred properly or being taken up by them, and indeed the content of them, and how this is perhaps leading to failures or in some cases, of course, successes. We need to understand that a bit better based on what we know so far about this case.
And you've looked into this organisation Prevent and the programme itself at the Henry Jackson Society, and you found it to be wanting rather severely in some areas, and also, like many things in our society these days, it's been sort of hobbled in some way by sort of political correctness.
Well, exactly. I think the essential part is that we understand that the Prevent channel programs, the other programs as part of this whole setup, in theory do work if you were to follow them properly, but they appear to have been, as you say, hobbled by a mixture of political correctness and in some cases downright malevolence from people determined to stop them from succeeding. And when you take those factors together, when you look at the bureaucracy involved and how referrals are made, number one, how they're then pushed forward, and then again, the opposition of some groups in society, particularly some leaders in the Muslim community and some on the political left, who erroneously claim these are discriminatory programs and should be scrapped. Right. You begin to form a picture that, are these programs being allowed to do their job properly, or are they being hindered?
Yes. And is there an issue as well in our country? And I know we're talking, funnily enough, today about freedom. Freedom of speech is very important. People talk about it all the time. You know, we're now having an argument in the wake of the assassination, if you like, of Sir David Amess, of whether or not the toxicity of debate in this country has somehow caused it. And I'm not one of those who goes along with that. This is a separate incident as far as I'm concerned. But are we also guilty, perhaps, of allowing too much hate speech from people like Islamic fundamentalists, people who are allowed to make horrible pronouncements, whether it's online or whether it's in person, whether it's in mosques? You know, we don't seem to have a problem with letting people say some of the most ghastly things and threaten things, and nothing seems to happen about it.
Here's a great point, Mike. Firstly, I absolutely agree with you that there are two separate issues going on here, that this whole climate of debate issue has had nothing to do, it would appear, with this murder, which was carried out by an ideological hater, basically, who it wouldn't have mattered if the climate was peace and love. Right. That wouldn't have affected this sort of terrible action. However, your more general point is, I think what we're doing is we're living in an age when extremists have access to the widest possible audiences they've ever had in human history. And we're not catching up with the fact that that's been allowed to happen. So go back 20 years. If you were an extremist preacher 20 years ago, you were going to be speaking to a small group of people, and there was no ability to get your material out beyond where you were. You didn't have the internet. You didn't have easily accessible video. I mean, can you imagine lugging VHS tapes around, things?
Even cameras, you needed sort of 3 people to carry them,
Precisely, all these things that made it very. But in the last 20 years, there's been a communications revolution, and what that has enabled extremists is that they have been able to utilize current medium to mass broadcast their material. And we as societies have not caught up with that fact. And we've been allowing them to do it. We haven't put the proper safeguards in place. As you say, the boundary of what is hate speech versus free speech needs to be looked at again, because it's quite manifestly obvious that if there are people in this country preaching death to this country, that is hate speech and should not be allowed. And that, if they want to say it, it's fine, but they should not be able to broadcast it.
No, because surely as well, I mean, we're often told this, that we don't need to bring necessarily new laws in because we already have laws that cover it. Breach of the peace, or behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, as far as I know, is still an offence. If you're inciting people to violence, or if you're inciting people to kill other people, that's surely against the law, isn't it?
Well, precisely. And you obviously have rules such as incitement to terrorism. But in practice, it's been very difficult to bring prosecutions in this regard. And I think what you have to do is encourage change the bar on prosecuting these cases to make it much easier to use, as you say, current legislation in order to drive a safer agenda for social cohesion and national unity in this country. And clearly, there are people out there who, as you say, are fostering hatred, division, which could easily lead to breach of the peace or much worse. Then there are already ways to bring them to book. And we need to be much more confident as a country about pursuing these people and using the awesome power of the state for once for good by driving these people to the sidelines and beyond.
Yes. And in your report, which looks at the relationships between the police and MI5 and who gets referred where and all of that, I mean, do you suspect or do you know whether or not those institutions, which are institutions of law, are in fact just a bit too lily-livered to take this on? Are they worried about being accused of racism? Are they concerned that all they do is concentrate on Islamic fundamentalists? So now suddenly we put some money over here and we'll say we've got a big problem with right-wing extremism. And a number of times you hear on the news, right-wing extremism is on the rise. Well, not in my world, it isn't.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's an interesting case in point. Is there an increase in far-right extremism? There probably is, actually, Mike, if you think about it. But is it the main threat of extremism in this country?
Well, I haven't seen too many right-wing extremists running around stabbing people to death, have you?
But there have been terror cases. There have been plots. Not many, but there have been. So I don't want to for a moment suggest there's no threat from that quarter. But when you look at the resourcing and when you look at the cases being put forward today, it doesn't match who is on the terror list. If you look, the estimates are that probably around 90% of people on the terror watch list of over 40,000 people are radical Muslims.
Right.
Now that tells you that if you have a disconnect between that figure and the people being referred onto the programs, which there is, where you've got the far right in far greater numbers now being referred to the channel program, for example, the radical Muslims, you know that something's going wrong down the line. And clearly over the past few years, there's been a drive, a political correctness drive, and this ever-present Islamophobia charge that's hurled about anyone who wants to ask questions about people attacking others in the name of their religion. When you put those together, you realize a chilling effect has quite clearly occurred in people's willingness to refer those cases up the chain, because people are, understandably worried about being called racist. But it isn't racist, Mike, to try and stop terrorism in this country. And it isn't racist to point out that there was a particular problem with radical Islam as a conduit for this, just as there are other problems in other sects. But you have to look at the numbers here and go, this is a major problem for this country.
Well, that's right. I mean, the attack in Norway, for example, was carried out by an Islamic fundamentalist who happened to be white. He happened to be Norwegian. He happened to have decided to convert to Islam and become a terrorist. Now, how could that in any possible way, shape or form be considered to be a racist thing to point out?
Well, exactly. But here you have a confluence now of racism when it suits, to anti-religious issues when it suits, and any charge, which is why, of course, this whole argument about Islamophobia being the correct term is nonsense. It isn't a correct term. The correct term is anti-Muslim hatred if you want to look at racism towards people who happen to be Muslims, or religious hatred of that regard. And Islamophobia is a problem because, of course, it ties in anyone who says bad things about radical and extreme forms of Islam deemed to be an anti-Islamic issue. It's not. The reality is that Islam itself is under kind of constant turmoil between different wings within it, different interpretations. And you can know, if you say you can't criticize any of them, then you have a huge problem in terms of tackling the terrorist element at the very extreme end, who take very extreme interpretations.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the places that has the most anti-Muslim feeling in the entire world is India. But nobody ever accuses the Indian population of being racist towards Muslims, do they?
Well, actually, you'll find that many of the people who drive the Islamophobia charge do claim this and will say this in that regard. And again, in some cases, there may well be racism occurring or anti-religious feeling occurring. And we can't, deny that there isn't prejudice against Muslims, but that doesn't equate to not being able to criticize radical Muslims who are committing acts of violence or acts of extremism in the name
all
of
over the world, by the way.
Yes, which is what they see as their religion. Yeah. Now, that religion will not be shared, or that interpretation, I should say, will not be shared by the vast majority of Muslims around the world. And yet, though, it is a legitimate form of interpretation because there is no, if you like, clearinghouse of views within Islam that says that this is the authentic version. And that is the problem. You face conflicting interpretations, and that's why you have people who will be able to hew to these extreme cases and go, actually, this is Islam.
Yes, and because of this kind of tippy-toe approach, it actually makes things worse, because people who want to have a proper debate and want to have a conversation and do not wish to tar every single person who happens to be a Muslim with the terrorism brush, we don't actually get to do that because we don't get to talk about it. We're not allowed to say anything. You can't say that most actual, terrorist attacks in the world are carried out by Muslim fundamentalists. That's just a fact, right? It doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists. It doesn't mean that they're all bad people. And we need to get that out there.
Well, here's the whole point. You need to be able to have a nuanced, serious and adult conversation about religion, number one, about interpretations of religion, and, kind of any attempt to blanket either way, saying either Islam is a religion of war or Islam is a religion of peace, is doomed to failure, because you will constantly have examples to the contrary that will, jar with the conscience. The reality is, like any textual religion, Islam is open to interpretation. And if we're not able to discuss those interpretations, debate them, and then show how some of those interpretations lead to terrorism, then you have a massive problem in terms of tackling that issue, or just denying the problem full stop. It also, by the way, hurt the moderate wing of Islam massively to not be able to talk about this, because they are then seen to be within the communities not being able to carry out what they want to do, because extremists are gain strength from not being questioned. What you want, of course, is for everyone to be questioning the extremists so that the moderates gain the upper hand.
Well, exactly right. And that's precisely where we should be aiming. Dr. Alan Mendoza, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed